Hello and welcome to Health Matters on Channels Television. We are so glad you could join us. I am Mary Alale Yusuf. Many of us are used to our older loved ones starting to forget things more often than before. So, most know that age is a risk factor for increased forgetfulness. Sometimes it's more than just forgetfulness. It may be dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most common dementia, a group of mental conditions characterized by impairment in brain functions. As of now, according to the World Health Organization, more than 55 million people have dementia all over the world. About 60 to 70% of them are Alzheimer's. Globally, there are almost 10 million new cases every year. It is one of the major causes of disability and dependency among older adults globally. My guest today is a consultant family physician and vice president of Medical Initiative Africa, Dr. Agbo Ebuta. He joins us from our Abuja studio. You're welcome to the show. So tell us, does Alzheimer's have a cause?
Thank you for having me.
Indeed. Does Alzheimer's have a cause?
Well, Alzheimer does not have an established cause. What we can only talk about is what we call risk factors. These are things that are being over time shown by research to be associated with Alzheimer's. So you have things that are modifiable, there's things we can do something about, and that can help us slow down this disease. And then you have things that are not modifiable. So things that are not modifiable, you can't do anything about them. It's simply
like age.
A matter of time. Once you have those risk factors, it's going to happen. So to elaborate on that, factors that are said to be unmodifiable are things like age. So most of the patients who would present with Alzheimer's disease will be more than 65 years old. And a major proportion of them, of course, will be around the 80 years perimetry. So age, as clearly pointed out, is a risk factor. And that's why cases of Alzheimer are on the rise. Another factor that has been established is hereditary component. So the hereditary component is basically genetically connected, linked to certain gene. A particular gene has been found to increase the risk. So while the gene increases the risk, the presence of the gene does not guarantee that a patient would develop Alzheimer. It's just that the chances of that patient developing Alzheimer is much higher than the general population. So even if you are found with the gene, it's no guarantee you will develop Alzheimer, but you can take steps to slow it down. Trauma to the brain from accident, from engagement in certain types of sports, physical contact sports that involves increased risk of trauma to the brain can over time increase the risk. So these are the modifiable factors. Of course, these are the non-modifiable factors. Of course, there are other modifiable factors, things that we already know. Hypertension is a risk factor. This affects 30% of the Nigerian adult population, which translates to 30 million. Diabetes is also a risk factor. This affects as much as 6%. That translates to about 6-7 million Nigerians.
Okay.
Obesity,
Doctor,
which is an emerging problem. It's been shown now that...
Let me just quickly jump in there. Has it been proved that if one gives attention to these modifiable factors, it will reduce the incidence of Alzheimer's, and by how much?
Okay, it is established that in populations where these risk factors are on a lower level, the incidence of Alzheimer is far less. So in Nigeria, for example, we have found out that in the last 2 decades, Alzheimer has increased by as much as 400%. 400% is a huge number. We've gone from below maybe 1%, 1-2% prevalence to as much as 4.9% prevalence by the major conglomeration of several studies. So yes, and that has been mainly because non-communicable, we've gone through what you call a transition of the type and patterns of disease epidemiologically. That is the type and pattern of disease in our population. So we've moved from infectious diseases to what we call non-communicable diseases. Things like hypertension, diabetes, obesity, abnormal cholesterol level, and other risk factors like inactivity. We've moved from a very active population to a highly inactive population. We've moved from obesity of less than 5% to obesity in our population of about 15% and counting. We moved from overweight of less than 10% to overweight in our population of about 27% and counting. So why these modifiable risk factors are on the rise in the population, we expect that here's Alzheimer incidence would rise. So if you want to roll back and look at it, if we were to reverse our indices, our risk factors to 10, 20 years ago, then we would have reduced the prevalence of Alzheimer by as much as 300%. Because if it rose from 1% to 4-point-something%, or went up as much as 400% due to the transition in our epidemiology, it's not far-fetched, and it can be calibrated. We can assume and we can conclude that if we remove the new risk factors, we will go back to our previous prevalence. So then indeed, I can say by extension that if we were to start slowing down on modifiable risk factors, we will to a large extent reduce current incidence of Alzheimer by as much as 400%.
Okay, so we've established that forgetfulness is one of the symptoms, or should I say signs, of Alzheimer's. Are there others, or telltale signs of Alzheimer's?
Yes. To set the stage for that discussion, it may be nice to say that the brain has billions of neurons, has billions of tiny fibers. There are over 100 billion and counting. And this is like the hardware. Now, this is the hardware of the brain. But in addition to that, these wires connect and different parts, and they send messages across. So different parts of the brain perform different functions. It has been shown by studies, research, and reaffirmed over time that the first part of the brain that is affected is called the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is just one of the parts of the brain. Now, that is where memory, integration, storage, transmission, and all of that takes place. So because this is the part of the brain that is initially affected, most times you see patients presenting with what? Early onset memory abnormalities. So mild cognitive impairments may present as problems with forgetfulness. And the forgetfulness can be calibrated. It can just be forgetting just recent events, to forgetting intermediate events, to forgetting past events, and to not remembering at all. So it's a progressive thing, and Alzheimer is a spectrum. The symptoms is a spectrum from mild to severe, from early to late.
Okay, so is all memory loss some form of dementia then?
No, absolutely not. Indeed, memory loss can happen as a result of age. Now, when it is not at par with what is expected for that age, when it becomes socially impairing, when it becomes functionally disabling, then it becomes a problem. But indeed, infections in the brain can cause memory loss. Tumors in the brain can cause memory loss. Depression can cause memory loss. In fact, depression, severe depression, moderate depression has been shown to even simulate Alzheimer. And in that clinical scenario, it's called pseudo-depression. So you treat the patient for depression, and the patient's memory comes back. So there are multiple possible causes of what? Memory loss. And age is a factor. However, when you have seen a doctor and all the other possible causes has been ruled out, and you have evidence to consistently show that in addition to memory loss, you have all the other symptoms that are associated with Alzheimer under the dementia bracket, then you can establish a diagnosis. So this is a clinical diagnosis.
So how exactly,
to make
how many things do you need to see?
Yes.
And what exactly do you need to see to make that diagnosis?
Okay, to make a definitive diagnosis of dementia, you can only do it in a person that has died. You take a brain, you slice it up, and you look at the brain under the microscope. You will be looking for abnormal collections of certain types of proteins. Two types. One protein collects into like a clump of protein. We call it the plaque. And the other proteins are fibers. So they collect into like a tangle. So once you can stain the slide, look at the microscope, you can make a definitive diagnosis. That is not possible in the clinical scenario. So what we do typically in the clinic is that we evaluate patients, we take their history from them, we examine them, and very importantly, we also take history from their relatives, their close ones, people who have had contact with them for a period of time. These are the people who establish that this patient has been forgetting, this patient has problem with language, this patient has problem with function, this patient is overly dependent on people for even basic activities of daily living. So to a large extent, that diagnosis is clinical and involves collecting data. Now, one of the very key components of the diagnosis is what we call the mental state examination. So we use different tools, checklists, ask specific questions, and you are able to score. Now, the score tells you the degree of loss of brain function, cognitive decline. So you can measure it objectively and stage your patient. So in terms of diagnosis is clinical, involves discussing, taking the history from the patient, from the relatives, examining the patient, and of course you would have to do other tests to confirm that there are no other possible confounders or risk factors or health problems, because Alzheimer patients would have hypertension, may have hypertension, diabetes, abnormal cholesterol, or other risk factors, and you have to treat those things because it has been shown that some of those other health conditions would worsen the clinical outcome or accelerate the progress of this condition.
Some people, you know, they walk into a room, they wanted to say something, and they've forgotten what it is totally. But then they go back, maybe they retrace their steps back into where they came from, and then it comes like a light, or after a few minutes they say, I remember now. Where do you place that kind of person?
For the purposes of this discussion, in the absence of enough time to elaborate deeply on that, I would say that the person just has forgetfulness. Now, under forgetfulness, you may have things like mild cognitive impairment, which sometimes is the early stage of dementia and Alzheimer. You may have things like just short-term memory, difficulty with forming short-term memory. So yes, any patient who is experiencing that, it is proper and appropriate for that patient to be evaluated by a doctor because Alzheimer cannot be reversed. However, it can be the clinical manifestation, that is how much it impairs the function, the quality of life of the patient, can be adjusted, it can be recalibrated, it can be improved upon so that the patient is more functional. So it's important that early assessment is critical and we need to get it out there.
Okay, doctor, we have to go on a short break now, but be thinking about this before we come back. If Alzheimer's and dementia is so common, why is everybody hiding from it? People don't talk about it. We don't see them. But that's after the break. Stay with us. We're coming back shortly. Welcome back. This is Health Matters on Channels Television, and we're talking about Alzheimer's, the most common form of dementia. In order to get your questions answered, please call 0808-054-2233. It should be showing on your screen now. You can also send a message on X at CTV_Mary A, or just send email to moalale@channelstv.com. Dr. Agbo Egbuta, we were thinking, you know, of why does it seem people avoid the topic of Alzheimer's, of dementia? Why does it seem like they're hiding?
There are potentially many explanations. Number one is that they simply do not even know what it entails, what it's about. It's a magical disease. Imagine an old woman. In the middle of the night, they are looking for her, and they find her in the bush. And she sits down, and she's just maybe making some movements with her body, and she's making statements. And they ask her, Mama, where are you? And she says, who are you? And they say, what are you doing here? She says, leave me alone. She becomes confrontational and all of that. I tell you that in our local community, she will be branded a witch. So most times, most of the old people in our communities who have these symptoms that cannot be explained, they are forgetting where they are, they forget what they are doing, they cannot remember, and they have an adjusted, altered personality. They are misdiagnosed, mainly because of what we call our health belief. So people believe that some of these things may be spiritual, or they may be coming from one or two other sources that are not explained by orthodox medicine. So
let me quickly jump in there. We have a caller.
Yes,
sorry
please.
to interrupt. We have a caller. Joseph is calling from Abuja. What's your question, Joseph? Do we have you, Joseph? I think we lost Joseph. We lost Joseph. Okay. So this is exactly what I wanted you to explain. Show us what it looks like. Let me ask you, why would that woman have been in the bush by that time of the night? What took her there?
For simple reasons. She has no idea what she's doing. She probably stood up to go to urinate, missed her way because she was not familiar with her own surrounding, her own house she has stayed for several years. And she found herself outside and just kept what? Straying. And then by the time she got somewhere, the brain is supposed to integrate visuospatial stimulation. The brain is supposed to allow you to recognize where you are. The brain is supposed to process what you say in response to what you are asked, to communicate rationally. When the brain function fails in Alzheimer, all these functions collapse. And if these functions collapse, abnormal behavior is what you see. Some of them become confrontational. In the early stage, some confabulate. You ask them about how was their trip, and they start telling you how the party was or how their meal was in the morning, and they play around it until somehow they remember and they come back to it. So that's called confabulation. Now, it is very common. We had in 2015 at least 300 and counting thousands of our parents, compatriots, uncles, aunties who had this condition. But some of them in the villages were misdiagnosed. Some of them were beaten up. Some of them were blamed for accidents and death and unfortunate happenings. A pregnant woman loses a baby and someone is looked for to be blamed. And of course, is the only person who cannot express his or herself, who cannot explain what she's doing in the middle of the night outside or early in the morning seated in one part of the village. So these are the issues. Health education, we need to educate our people that if you see somebody behaving abnormally, you need a medical evaluation. It may not only be Alzheimer. It may be other conditions like mental health conditions like Parkinson's, schizophrenia, and the rest. But you need to evaluate this patient. So we need to. That is one. The other part is that, of course, we have a health system that requires significant readjustment, optimization, and upgrading. We have 30,000 and counting primary health care centers, but about 6,000 to 10,000 based on figures out there may be functional. Now, how do you service 200 million people? 200 million people in 774 local governments. If you have somebody in a remote part of Nigeria who has no access to health care, of course, he will end up going to the local dibia, the local imam, or the local babalawo, who will now claim, after doing his incantation, that this problem may be as a result of an attack, a spiritual attack, or some harm that the patient attempted to do to another person in the community.
Let me quickly jump in there.
So we need to...
We need to take a call from one of our viewers. We're having Okuns from UK. Hello, what's your question?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. What's your question? Go ahead.
Please, thank you. What the topic in Nigerian context, we don't have a very clear understanding of what dementia or Alzheimer's is. Although there are different types of dementia, but you are concentrating on Alzheimer's disease. I wouldn't want to waste much time, but I only have, my question is, what are we doing to let people understand about what Alzheimer's is?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
What is the government doing?
Okay.
For what extent have we created awareness so that, like what the doctor said, if such a thing happens, maybe a woman doesn't know where she is, what is wrong with her, or where, her surroundings, and she'll be branded a witch. And in the process, they may end up killing the woman or end up doing something that is very heinous. So most people in our community
we seem to have lost
an untold hardship because of their condition. It's a degenerative condition that has to come with age, and it's not their problem. It may come within the range the doctor mentioned.
Thanks, Okon. Let me put that question to the doctor now. Thank you. So, Doctor, Okon is asking how much education have we put out there for people to know? Let me just quickly put this in here. You know, when somebody has a new baby, there's a band they put on the wrist of the baby because the baby doesn't know anything, doesn't know where he is, and doesn't know who he is. Shouldn't we consider something like that maybe for some of our older relatives who are going through this so that they can at least get back home?
Well, 100%. I will start from your last comment. I'm with you. I'm there 100% because people who have this disability can easily lose disorientation. They can easily lose orientation. So labeling them, putting a name, a phone number, and a contact person where if they were to find themselves missing is a given. We should consider it, and we should find a way to operationalize it in a sustainable way. My brother from in the UK, Okon Abadie, so the issue now is that government, we do not speak for government. Government is trying what they can. The current Minister of Health has come up with a 4-point agenda. He's going to look at improving governance and leadership in the health sector. He's going to look at building and increasing investment in health infrastructure. He's also going to look at local production of drugs and pharmaceuticals, and of course he's going to build on human resource and a couple of other things. These are the things we expect him to see. We also expect him to implement them in a cost-effective and sustainable manner. But of course we need to appreciate channels television for providing this platform. This program is reaching millions of people across. You are calling from the UK, so that's what we are doing. We are reaching millions of people through various media platforms, and we are providing this information. So it's a call out to social media influencers, to everybody in the media space. It's a common responsibility for all of us, and we can throw it. The Humanist Society of Nigeria is one organization that is also creating a lot of awareness. They are doing deliberate advocacy to reduce the victimization of witches and witchcrafts and all of those things in our local communities where people are wrongly labeled. In fact, I think recently they secured an indictment and a jail term for 1 or 2 of those accused people who lynched an elderly woman who was accused of being a witch. So it is beyond what government is doing. As much as I would like to go on,
it is our collective. Dr. Ibuta, yes. We are out of time, but thank you so much for that education. I like particularly how you gave us a picture of what someone with this condition might look like. Thank you so much for coming to the show.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, viewers, for being there to sit with us and learn more about this condition. Let's do it again next week. I'm Mary Alale Yusuf.